Little did they know the man kneading dough with flour-covered hands was more than just a simple baker. He was a ghost from the battlefields of Gettysburg, whose trigger finger had sent 300 Confederate soldiers to their graves. Behind those gentle eyes that measured cups of sugar lay the deadliest marksman the Union Army had ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook Valley, a small town carved into the heart of the Arizona Territory. The year was 1875, and the scent of fresh bread wafted through the early morning air, drawing sleepy-eyed cowboys and miners toward the newly opened Heavenly Crust Bakery. Inside, Thomas Grace moved with practiced precision, his weathered hands crafting delicate pastries with the same careful attention he once used to clean his Springfield rifle during those long nights in the war. The locals had wondered about the quiet baker when he arrived 3 months ago, purchasing Old Man Henderson's failed grocery store with cash and transforming it into something the territory had never seen. He didn't fit their image of a man who worked with delicate French pastries and intricate cake decorations. Something about his posture, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, suggested a man more acquainted with gunpowder than powdered sugar. But his sourdough bread was the best anyone had ever tasted, and his apple pies brought tears to the eyes of hardened ranchers. So they accepted his presence, if not his mysteries. The Mackenzie gang had different ideas about the newcomer. Ever since they'd seized control of the county 6 months ago, no new business opened without paying their steep insurance fees. Bill Mackenzie, the youngest of the 3 brothers, watched the bakery from across the street, his fingers drumming impatiently against his gun belt. The sight of the baker's success, operating freely while other businesses paid through the nose, had been burning in his craw for weeks. Behind him, the undertaker's shop stood as a grim reminder of what happened to those who defied the Mackenzie's authority. Inside the bakery, Grace sensed the mounting tension. His hands remained steady as he shaped a wedding cake for the mayor's daughter, but his mind catalogued every detail around him. The weight of his hidden Remington pressed against his lower back, as familiar as the rolling pin in his hands. 7 years in the war and 5 years hunting deserters afterward had taught him to read the signs. Violence was coming, as surely as his bread would rise. He'd chosen this moment carefully, letting the Mackenzies' frustration build until it overwhelmed their caution. Sarah Cooper, the young widow who ran the general store next door, entered with her usual grace. Her husband had been one of the first to stand against the Mackenzies when they arrived in Millbrook Valley. Now she ran the store alone, paying their extortionate fees to survive. Her eyes carried a warning as she placed her daily order. "The Mackenzies were asking about you, Mr. Grace, about your background, where you came from." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "About why you don't seem concerned about their protection fees. They've been watching the bakery all morning." Grace's hands never stopped working the dough as he nodded. Kind of them to take an interest. His voice was soft, almost gentle, betraying nothing of the calculations running through his mind. He'd chosen Millbrook Valley carefully, tracking the Mackenzie gang's movement through 4 territories. Their reign of terror had gone unchecked for too long, and too many good people had suffered. Like Sarah's husband, gunned down in broad daylight for daring to speak against their tyranny. Outside, more of the Mackenzie gang gathered, their horses crowding the hitching posts. The townspeople hurried past, eyes downcast, already anticipating the violence to come. They'd seen this pattern before, the gathering of thugs, the deliberate intimidation, and then the brutal lesson taught to those who defied the gang's authority. Old Tom Wilson, watching from his barber shop across the street, shook his head sadly. He'd seen 4 businesses destroyed in similar fashion, their owners either dead or run out of town. What they couldn't see was the slight smile that crossed Grace's features as he heard the approaching bootsteps, His fingers, dusted with flour, had ended more lives than anyone in the territory would believe. He'd spent months establishing his cover, perfecting his recipes with the same patience he once used to line up impossible shots. During the war, they'd called him Ghost Eyes, Grace, the silent death that came without warning. Now he wore a baker's apron instead of a sharpshooter's coat, but underneath he remained the same man who had once held an entire Confederate regiment at bay for 3 days at Missionary Ridge. The bell above the door chimed as Bill Mackenzie swaggered in, flanked by 2 of his most vicious enforcers. The smell of fresh bread mixed with cheap whiskey and trail dust. Grace continued his work, seemingly absorbed in the delicate task of frosting a row of cinnamon rolls. The same hands that had once dropped a Confederate officer at 800 yards now carefully drizzled icing in perfect lines. "Quite the operation you've built here, Baker man," Mackenzie drawled, his spurs jingling as he approached the counter. "Shame if something were to happen to it." His enforcers spread out, hands resting on their holsters, confident in their routine of intimidation. The morning sun, streaming through the front windows, cast their shadows long across the polished wooden floor. Grace finally looked up, and something in his gaze made Mackenzie's next words catch in his throat. The baker's eyes weren't filled with the usual fear they encountered. Instead, they held the cold, calculating look of a predator assessing its prey. For the first time in months, Bill Mackenzie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. In those eyes, he saw something he hadn't encountered since the war, the gaze of a man who had faced death so often that it had become an old friend. The silence in the bakery stretched like pulled taffy, broken only by the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. Bill Mackenzie shifted his weight, unsettled by the baker's unblinking stare. Behind the counter, Thomas Grace's flour-covered hands remained steady as he set down his piping bag with deliberate care. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, cast strange shadows across the fresh loaves of bread, making them look like sleeping soldiers in neat rows. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Mackenzie," Grace said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when discussing pastry recipes with elderly customers. "Though I must admit, I expected the famous Mackenzie gang to send someone more substantial for their first visit." His eyes flicked briefly to the 2 enforcers, noting their nervous trigger fingers and poorly concealed weapons. Amateur work, nothing like the disciplined gunmen he'd faced during the war. Bill Mackenzie's face flushed red with rage. At 26, he was the youngest of the Mackenzie brothers and constantly fighting to prove himself worthy of the family name. "You've got quite a mouth on you for a man who spends his days playing with sugar and flour," he snarled, taking a threatening step forward. His hand dropped to his holster, a movement that had made countless shopkeepers and ranchers quiver with fear. Grace didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for a fresh apple tart, wrapped it carefully in paper, and held it out across the counter. "On the house," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Your mother must have taught you it's impolite to discuss business without breaking bread first." The mention of his mother made Mackenzie's trigger finger twitch. Nobody in Millbrook Valley dared to speak so casually to a Mackenzie. Behind him, his enforcers exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't following their usual script of intimidation and submission. Sarah Cooper, still standing near the door, held her breath, her hands clutching her order basket until her knuckles turned white. "Now see here, baker man," Mackenzie spat, ignoring the offered pastry. "Every business in Millbrook Valley pays for protection, 20% of weekly earnings, paid every Sunday after church. Those who don't pay—" He let the threat hang in the air, gesturing vaguely toward the undertaker's shop across the street. Grace set the tart down on the counter and brushed flour from his apron with those same deliberate movements. "Interesting proposal," he said, as if discussing the weather. "Though I have to wonder, who protects the protectors?" His eyes met Mackenzie's, and for a moment, the young gunman caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Behind that gentle baker's demeanor lay the calculating gaze of a man who had dealt death on a scale that made the Mackenzies' brutal reputation seem like child's play. "Are you threatening me?" Mackenzie's voice cracked slightly, his bravado wavering. His right-hand man, Jake Tucker, took a step forward, hand on his gun. The other enforcer, a brutish man known only as the Butcher, moved to block the door. Grace's smile widened fractionally. "Threatening? No, Mr. Mackenzie, I'm educating. You see, during the war, I learned that every man has two ingredients inside him: courage and fear. Right now, you're showing me a lot more of the latter than the former." His hands disappeared beneath the counter, and both enforcers tensed. When they reappeared, they held only a rolling pin, which he began cleaning with methodical precision. "You've got till sundown to reconsider your position," Mackenzie snarled, trying to regain control of the situation. "After that, well..." He gestured to the Butcher, who drew his knife and began carving deep gouges into one of Grace's pristine display cases. Grace watched the vandalism with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the confrontation. "Interesting choice," he remarked, "though you might want to ask around about what happened to the last man who tried to intimidate me with a blade. If you can find all the pieces of him, that is." The casual mention of dismemberment, delivered in the same tone one might use to discuss bread recipes, finally cracked Mackenzie's facade. He backed toward the door, nearly tripping over his own spurs. "Sundown, Baker man. Your choice. Pay up or burn down." With that, he and his men retreated into the morning sun, leaving behind the scarred display case and the untouched apple tart. Sarah Cooper approached the counter once they'd gone, her face pale. "Mr. Grace, I've seen what they do to people who stand up to them. My Robert." She trailed off, unable to finish. Grace picked up his piping bag and resumed decorating the cinnamon rolls as if nothing had happened. "Mrs. Cooper," he said gently, "I suggest you close your store early today, and perhaps spread the word. Anyone who doesn't want to witness what's coming should stay inside after sundown." He piped another perfect spiral of frosting. "Things in Millbrook Valley are about to change." Outside, Bill Mackenzie mounted his horse, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. Something about the baker's eyes haunted him. They weren't the eyes of a man who feared death, but rather of one who had dealt it out so often that it had become routine. He spurred his horse toward the Mackenzie ranch, eager to report to his older brothers. They needed to handle this baker before sundown, needed to make an example of him. Little did he know, Thomas Ghost Eyes Grace was already preparing for their return. Behind the counter, beneath the fresh bread and sweet pastries, lay the tools of his true trade: a matched pair of custom Remingtons, a Springfield rifle that had ended the lives of 300 Confederate soldiers, and enough ammunition to start a small war. By sundown, Millbrook Valley would learn why they used to say that Death himself learned marksmanship from Thomas Grace. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Word of the confrontation at Heavenly Crust Bakery spread through Millbrook Valley like wildfire. By midday, the town buzzed with speculation about the quiet baker who had dared to stand against the Mackenzies. Inside Wilson's barbershop, old-timers gathered to share theories and memories, their voices hushed despite the rhythmic snipping of scissors and the gentle scrape of straight razors. Old Tom Wilson, whose hands had been steady with a razor for 40 years, paused in his work as he recalled something. "You know," he said, addressing the crowded shop, "there was a sharpshooter during the war they called Ghost Eyes. Union man. They said he could hit a playing card edge-on at 400 yards. He stroked his grey-streaked beard thoughtfully. "Never saw the man myself, but I had a cousin at Gettysburg who told me stories. Said this Ghost Eyes fellow once held off an entire Confederate battalion single-handed, picking them off one by one until they thought they were fighting an entire company." Dr. James Morrison, waiting for his monthly trim, leaned forward in his chair. "I treated Mr. Grace last month when he burned his hand on that new stove of his," he interjected. "Man's got scars I've never seen before, and I served as an army surgeon. One on his left shoulder looked like a Confederate Whitworth bullet, the kind their elite sharpshooters used." He lowered his voice. "And those eyes of his, they're the eyes of a man who's seen more death than the devil himself." Sarah Cooper entered the barber shop, still shaken from the morning's events. The usual cheerful bell above the door seemed to ring with ominous significance. "The Mackenzies just rode past my store again," she announced to the gathered crowd. "Headed toward their ranch. Bill Mackenzie looked scared, really scared. I've never seen any of them look like that before." The barber shop fell silent as Judge Henry Whitaker, who had been quietly listening from his corner chair, cleared his throat. "5 years ago," he began, his judicial voice carrying the weight of historical significance, "I presided over a case in Denver. Railroad company was being terrorized by former Confederate guerrillas. Until one day, they weren't. Found all 12 outlaws dead one morning, each shot through the heart at impossible distances. Never did find the shooter, but rumors spoke of a Union veteran who'd taken up bounty hunting. They said he had eyes that could spot a sparrow at 1,000 yards. In his bakery, Thomas Grace continued his work, seemingly unconcerned about the approaching confrontation. Every movement was precise, whether he was kneading dough or checking the pristine weapons hidden beneath his counter. The morning's customers had dwindled to nothing, the town holding its breath in anticipation of what sundown would bring. Mayor Frederick Drummond pushed through the barbershop door, his usual pompous demeanor subdued. "Just received a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office," he announced without preamble. "I asked about any records of a Thomas Grace." He paused, building dramatic tension. "They said there's no such person. But they did mention that after the war, a Union sharpshooter started working for the government, hunting down the worst outlaws in the territory. Never learned his real name. He used a different one in every town. They only knew him by the precision of his shots and the number of lives he'd taken. Always through the heart, always at impossible distances." Meanwhile, at the Mackenzie Ranch, the three brothers gathered in their study, an opulent room that spoke of their ill-gotten gains. James Mackenzie, the eldest, listened to Bill's report with growing concern. "You're sure about his eyes?" he demanded. "Describe them exactly as you saw them?" Bill nodded, still unsettled. "Like looking into frozen glass, Jim, like he was measuring the distance to my heart." The middle brother, Frank Mackenzie, threw back his whiskey. "I heard stories during the war," he said slowly, "about a Union marksman they called Ghost Eyes. Man was a demon with a rifle. They said he could kill you 3 days before you knew you were dead." He set down his glass with a heavy thunk. "Last I heard, he was hunting war criminals for the government, making them answer for their crimes." James Mackenzie's face darkened. The Mackenzie brothers had their own history with the war, one they'd buried deep beneath their current reputation. "If he's who you think he is," James said quietly, "then he's not here about our protection fees. He's here about Chancellorsville." Back in town, Grace received an unexpected visitor. Marshal Daniel Harper, retired these past 5 years, stepped into the bakery. His silver star, though no longer official, still gleamed on his chest. "Been a while, Thomas," he said softly, using a name they both knew was false. "Still baking death into your justice, I see." Grace continued rolling dough, but his eyes met the marshal's with recognition. "Some stains," he replied quietly. "Don't wash out with just water and soap. Sometimes you need flour to absorb the blood." He gestured to a fresh loaf of sourdough. "Hungry?" Harper accepted a slice, noting how Grace's hands never fully turned away from his hidden weapons. "Mackenzies are gathering every gun hand they can find," he informed his old colleague. Word is they're offering $50 a gun. Already got 20 men at the ranch. Grace's smile was slight but genuine. 20 men, he mused, all bunched together in one place. Makes things simpler. He checked the position of the sun through his window. About 4 hours till sundown, just enough time for the dough to rise. His eyes, those famous ghost eyes that had ended so many lives, turned toward the Mackenzie ranch, and for old sins to come due. In the barbershop, old Tom Wilson finally spoke, the fear growing in everyone's mind. War's coming back to Millbrook Valley, he announced to the silent room. Only question is, how many will die before the sun rises tomorrow? Sarah Cooper, hearing this, hurried back to her store. In her back room, she opened an old trunk and removed a wrapped bundle, her late husband's Springfield rifle. Robert had died, standing up to the Mackenzies. Perhaps it was time his rifle helped finish what he'd started. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Grace began preparing for sundown with the same methodical precision he used in his baking. Each weapon was checked, each bullet counted, each line of sight calculated. The Mackenzies were about to learn that some men don't just fight for justice, they serve it. Hot and fresh, with the precision of a master chef and the deadly accuracy of a ghost from their darkest wartime memories. In the gathering afternoon heat, James Mackenzie stood before the massive fireplace in his study, staring at an old tin-type photograph he'd kept hidden for 13 years. The image showed 3 young Confederate officers standing proud in their gray uniforms, their faces untouched by the weight of what was to come. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood the tents of their unit at Chancellorsville. "You remember that morning, Frank?" James asked his brother, his voice heavy with memory. "May 2nd, 1863, the morning we led those Union boys into that trap." He traced the edge of the photograph with a trembling finger. 243 men. We told them we were deserters, led them right into that valley. Then our boys opened up from both sides. Frank Mackenzie shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the weight of the past settling over him like a burial shroud. "We were at war, Jim. Everyone did things they ain't proud of." But his voice lacked conviction. Even after all these years, the screams of dying men still haunted his dreams. "That's not what's eating at you, though, is it?" James continued, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "It's what happened after, when that Union sharpshooter started picking off our men, one by one, for 3 days straight. Couldn't find him, couldn't stop him, just had to watch as he executed our entire command staff, through the heart, every single one." Bill Mackenzie, the youngest, listened with growing horror. He'd been too young for the war, had only heard fragments of his brother's past. "You think the baker, this ghost eyes, he was there?" The pieces were finally falling into place. Why his brothers had built their empire in the remote Arizona territory, why they never talked about the war, why they'd changed their name from McKinnon to Mackenzie. "He wasn't just there," James said quietly. "He was one of the men we betrayed, the only survivor. We thought he died in that valley with the rest. Should have known better. A man like that, death itself fears him too much to take him." Back in town, Thomas Grace sat in the quiet of his bakery's back room, cleaning his Springfield rifle, the same rifle he'd used at Chancellorsville. The weapon was old now, but like its owner, age had only made it more deadly. His mind drifted back to that blood-soaked valley, to the moment when he'd realized the deserters' betrayal. He'd been the unit's best shot, the only one positioned far enough back to escape the initial slaughter. For 3 days afterward, he'd brought justice to the traitors who'd murdered his friends. One shot, one death again and again until the valley ran red with Confederate blood. But 3 men had escaped, 3 officers who'd orchestrated the massacre. He'd spent years tracking them, following whispers and rumors, waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah Cooper entered the back room quietly, carrying his afternoon coffee. She paused at the sight of the rifle across his lap. "You knew them during the war, didn't you?" she asked softly. "The Mackenzies. That's why you came to Millbrook Valley." Grace looked up, his ghost eyes softening slightly at her presence. "They called themselves the McKinnon brothers back then," he confirmed. "Confederate officers who specialized in deception. They'd pretend to desert, lead Union units into ambush. Chancellorsville was their masterpiece, an entire company wiped out." He checked the rifle's sight with practiced care, all except one man. "You," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You survived, and then you." "I did what I was trained to do," Grace replied quietly. "What I was better at than any man in the Union Army. I brought justice, one shot at a time." He carefully reassembled the rifle, but 3 of them escaped, changed their names, built this little empire of fear. Now it's time to finish what I started in that valley. At the Mackenzie Ranch, hired guns continued to arrive, drawn by the promise of easy money. None of them knew they were being gathered like sheep for slaughter. James Mackenzie watched them from his window, remembering how his own men had fallen to Ghost Eye's rifle. Each shot had come from a different direction, making it impossible to locate the shooter. By the 3rd day, his men had been so terrified they'd started shooting at shadows. Marshal Harper made his way through town, warning citizens to stay inside after sundown. In the barber shop, old Tom Wilson shared more stories he'd heard about Ghost Eyes. How he could hit a man between the eyes at 800 yards, how he'd once held off an entire Confederate regiment at Missionary Ridge, how he'd tracked deserters across 4 states after the war. "The thing about Ghost Eyes," Wilson told his captivated audience, "wasn't just that he was the best shot in the army. It was that he never missed. Not once. Every shot was a killing shot. They said he could read the wind by watching a man's hair move, could judge distance better than an engineer's tools. But most of all, they said he had infinite patience, would wait days for the perfect shot." In his study, James Mackenzie made a decision. "Send someone to the baker," he ordered. "Tell him we know who he is. Tell him we're willing to negotiate." But even as the messenger rode out, James knew it was futile. Men like Ghost Eyes didn't negotiate with traitors, they just killed them. The messenger found Grace preparing a fresh batch of bread, as if the coming confrontation was nothing more than a minor interruption to his baking schedule. The baker listened to the offer without comment, then returned to his work. "Tell James Mackenzie that 13 years ago, he and his brothers murdered 243 good men through treachery," Grace said finally. "Tell him I remember every one of their names. Tell him that at sundown I'm going to add 3 more names to that list." As the messenger rode back to the ranch, Grace began his final preparations. Each window in the bakery offered a different firing line. Each rooftop in town provided a potential sniper's nest. He'd spent 3 months planning this, learning every angle, every shadow, every possibility. The Mackenzies thought they were preparing for a siege. In reality, they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Sarah Cooper watched him work, reminded of how her husband had stood against the Mackenzies' tyranny. "Robert would have helped you," she said quietly, "if he'd known what you were planning." Grace nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your husband died trying to bring justice to this town, Mrs. Cooper. After sundown, I'm going to finish what he started." He checked the sun's position again. 2 hours left, just enough time for one last batch of bread to rise and for old debts to come due. James Mackenzie paced the length of his study, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots like the timbers of a sinking ship. The messenger's return had confirmed his worst fears. Through the window, he watched as more hired guns arrived at the ranch, their numbers now swelling past 30. Each new arrival made his chest tighter. They weren't reinforcements, he realized, but witnesses to what was about to unfold. "Get me Carlton Webb," he ordered Frank, his voice carrying the edge of desperate calculation. Webb had been their best tracker during the war, a man who could read sign like others read newspapers. If anyone could outmaneuver Ghost Eyes, it would be him. Frank hesitated at the door, his face ashen. Webb's dead, Jim. Found him this morning in his cabin up in Morrison's Creek. Single shot through the heart, fired from at least 600 yards. The implication hung heavy in the air. Grace hadn't just arrived 3 months ago. He'd been in the territory far longer, methodically eliminating potential threats, preparing the battlefield with the same precision he used to measure flour and sugar. James grabbed the whiskey bottle from his desk, his hands shaking as he poured. "How many others?" he demanded. "7 of our best men," Frank replied quietly. "All found the same way. Long-range shots, no witnesses. Been happening over the past year. We thought it was just bad luck, maybe rival gangs. But he's been hunting us, Jim, removing every advantage before we even knew he was here." In town, Marshal Harper visited the telegraph office, sending a carefully coded message to his contacts in the territorial capital. If things went badly tonight, someone needed to know the truth about what happened in Millbrook Valley. The telegrapher, young Jimmy Watson, couldn't help noticing that the message mentioned both Chancellorsville and the name McKinnon. At the bakery, Grace continued his preparations with methodical care. Each window had been subtly marked with distance calculations, scratched into the wooden frames. Spare ammunition was positioned at strategic points throughout the building. His rifle rested in pieces across the counter, each component gleaming with fresh oil. To anyone watching, it might have looked like he was simply cleaning his weapon. In reality, he was performing the same ritual he'd done before every major engagement during the war. Sarah Cooper returned to her store, but found herself unable to focus on her usual tasks. The Springfield rifle that had belonged to her husband seemed to call to her from its hiding place. Robert had died trying to stand against the Mackenzies alone. Perhaps it was time for the town to stand together. She made her way to the barber shop, where the usual afternoon crowd had gathered. Old Tom Wilson looked up as she entered, reading the determination in her face. "Robert's rifle?" he asked quietly. She nodded. Wilson stroked his beard thoughtfully, then reached beneath his barber's chair and withdrew a well-oiled Henry repeater. "Saved this from my army days," he said. "Reckon it's about time it saw some use again." Throughout Millbrook Valley, similar scenes played out as the afternoon waned. Citizens who had lived under the Mackenzies' terror for too long began finding their courage, inspired by the quiet baker who dared to stand against tyranny. They didn't know his full story yet, didn't understand the depth of his connection to the Mackenzie brothers, but they recognized the steely resolve of a man who had faced death so often that it had become an old friend. Back at the ranch, Bill Mackenzie watched the hired guns preparing their weapons. "They don't stand a chance, do they?" he asked his oldest brother. James didn't respond immediately. His mind caught in memories of those 3 terrible days at Chancellorsville, watching his men fall one by one to shots that seemed to come from nowhere. "Ghost Eyes doesn't just kill men," James said finally. "He breaks them first, makes them wait, knowing death is coming, but not when. By the 3rd day at Chancellorsville, my men were shooting at shadows, jumping at every twig snap. Some just sat there waiting for the bullet they knew would come. He drained his whiskey glass. That's why he opened a bakery. Wanted us to know he was here, wanted us to feel that same fear again." The sun continued its westward journey, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Grace stepped out of his bakery briefly, surveying the street with those phantom-pale eyes that had earned him his wartime name. To the casual observer, he might have been checking the weather or planning the next day's baking, but Marshal Harper, watching from across the street, recognized the movements of a marksman, calculating ranges and identifying firing positions. "Your men are in position?" Grace asked quietly as Harper approached. The marshal nodded. During the war, he'd served as Ghost Eyes spotter, helping him make those impossible shots that became legend. Now, 13 years later, they were about to repeat history. 4 men on the livery stable roof, Harper confirmed. 3 more in the church tower. Got a clear view of every approach to town. He paused, studying his old friend's face. You really going through with this? Taking on 30 men? Grace's smile was slight, but genuine. 30 men bunched together make an easier target than 3 men scattered, he replied. The Mackenzies have spent 13 years running from what they did at Chancellorsville. Tonight, the running stops. He checked the position of the sun again. About an hour left. Just enough time. He returned to his bakery, where the smell of fresh bread still filled the air. The same hands that had brought death to hundreds now carefully removed a final batch of loaves from the oven. In his mind, he recited the names of the men who had died in that valley 13 years ago, just as he did every night. By sunrise tomorrow, those spirits would finally rest easy. The Mackenzie brothers mounted their horses, leading their small army toward town. Behind them, the setting sun painted their shadows long across the desert, like fingers of death reaching for Millbrook Valley. But death was already waiting for them, wearing a baker's apron and carrying a rifle that had never known mercy. The setting sun painted Millbrook Valley's main street in shades of amber and crimson as Thomas Grace emerged from his bakery. He had exchanged his flour-dusted apron for a long black duster that had seen better days. The townsfolk who remained on the street noticed how the garment hung on his frame, not like a coat, but like a second skin. It was the kind of coat a man wore when he needed to conceal weapons, yet required the freedom to draw them in the blink of an eye. Marshal Harper stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, watching as Grace methodically checked his weapons one final time. The Springfield rifle, its wood worn smooth by years of use, gleamed with fresh oil. 2 Remington revolvers rode in specially modified holsters, positioned for a cross-draw that Harper had seen end dozens of lives during the war. "You're really going to face them in the open?" Harper asked, though he already knew the answer. Grace had always preferred to let his targets see him coming. It wasn't just about killing them. It was about justice, about making them face their crimes before the end. "They deserve to know who's sending them to hell," Grace replied, his ghost-pale eyes scanning the street. The Mackenzie brothers were due to arrive any minute, leading their band of hired guns into what they thought would be an overwhelming show of force. Besides, a proper baker always shows his face when serving what he's prepared. Sarah Cooper emerged from her store, Robert's old Springfield cradled in her arms. She wasn't alone. Behind her came old Tom Wilson with his Henry repeater, Dr. Morrison with a weathered Sharps carbine, and at least a dozen other townspeople armed with whatever weapons they could muster. They formed a loose semicircle behind Grace, their faces set with determination. "Mrs. Cooper," Grace said without turning, "I don't recall asking for assistance in this matter." His voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the softness, the same tone he'd used when commanding sharpshooters during the war. "You didn't have to ask, Mr. Grace," she replied firmly. "Robert died trying to stand against them alone. We won't make that mistake again." Around her, other citizens nodded in agreement. The Mackenzies had ruled through fear for too long. It was time for the town to reclaim its dignity. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced the approach of the Mackenzie brothers and their hired guns. Grace turned to address the gathered townspeople, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "What's about to happen isn't just about revenge," he said clearly. "It's about justice. 13 years ago, the McKinnon brothers, who you know as the Mackenzies, committed an act of treachery that resulted in the deaths of 243 Union soldiers. They pretended to be deserters, led those men into a trap, and watched them die." A murmur ran through the crowd as Grace continued. "I was there. I watched my friends, my brothers in arms, cut down without a chance to defend themselves. I spent the next 3 days bringing justice to those responsible, but these 3 escaped. His voice carried the weight of years spent tracking, planning, waiting for this moment. They fled west, changed their names, and built an empire on the same principles of fear and treachery that served them during the war. The dust cloud grew larger, individual riders becoming visible. Grace checked his weapons one final time as he spoke. Today, that ends. Not just their reign over this town, but their escape from justice. Those of you who wish to stand with me, I welcome your aid. Those who don't, I understand. But whatever you choose, remember this moment. Remember that justice, though sometimes slow, is inevitable. James Mackenzie led the column of riders into town, his brothers flanking him, the hired guns spread out behind them, their weapons gleaming in the dying sun. They had expected to find one man. Instead, they found a town awakened, its citizens armed and ready to fight. "Ghost eyes!" James called out, his voice carrying a tremor he couldn't quite hide. 13 years is a long time to hold a grudge. The hired guns looked confused at the name, but the fear in their employer's voice made them grip their weapons tighter. Grace stepped forward, letting them all see him clearly. Gone was the gentle baker who had spent months earning the town's trust. In his place stood the legendary marksman who had terrorized Confederate forces, the ghost who could end a man's life from distances other shooters couldn't even see. "Chancellorsville wasn't a grudge, James," he replied, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "It was a massacre, and massacres demand justice." The tension in the street built like heat in an oven, each second bringing them closer to the inevitable eruption of violence. Grace's eyes, those phantom pale orbs that had earned him his nickname, scanned the opposition with mechanical precision. Each distance had been measured, each angle calculated, each possible scenario planned for. "Last chance," Frank Mackenzie called out, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Ride away now. We'll call it square. Too many people are going to die if this plays out." Grace's response was to slowly remove his duster, revealing the heavily modified gun belt beneath. The leather was worn but well-maintained, each holster positioned precisely where years of practice had proven most effective. "The only people dying today," he said clearly, "are 3 traitors who've escaped justice for far too long." The sun touched the horizon, painting the scene in deep crimson. In moments like these, Grace always remembered his commander's words before that fateful day at Chancellorsville. "Justice comes to all men, Thomas. Some just need a little help finding it." The baker, who had served Millbrook Valley its daily bread, was gone. In his place stood Ghost Eyes, the deadliest marksman in Union Army history, ready to serve a different kind of justice. Behind him, the town stood ready to reclaim its freedom. Before him, 30 men were about to learn why Confederate soldiers used to make the sign of the cross at the mere mention of his name. The last rays of sunlight glinted off 30 gun barrels as the hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles. The tension in Millbrook Valley's main street had built to an unbearable pitch. James Mackenzie's face had turned ashen as he watched his former nightmare materialize before him, transformed from the gentle baker into the deadly spectre that had haunted his dreams for 13 years. Grace stood unmoved in the center of the street, his ghost-pale eyes calculating distances with inhuman precision. Behind him, the townspeople maintained their positions, drawing courage from his unwavering stance. Sarah Cooper's grip tightened on her husband Springfield as she watched the scene unfold, remembering how Robert had died, standing alone against tyranny. This time would be different. "You know what's interesting about baking?" Grace's voice carried clearly in the evening air, as calm as if he were discussing recipes with a customer. "It's all about patience and precision. Too much heat, the bread burns. Too little, it never rises. But get it just right." His hand rested casually near his Remington. "Well, That's when magic happens. Bill Mackenzie, the youngest brother, felt his nerve breaking. "Just shoot him," he screamed at the hired guns. 30 against 1. What are you waiting for?" But the mercenaries hesitated, sensing something in Grace's demeanor that their instincts recognized as lethal. They'd been hired to intimidate a baker, not face a legend. "One thing about Ghost Eyes," Marshal Harper called out from his position near the general store. He never needed odds in his favor. "At Chancellorsville, after your ambush, he killed 78 men in 3 days. Each shot perfect, each man dead, before they heard the report of his rifle. Some of us still remember those days, don't we, James?" James Mackenzie's hand trembled as he drew his revolver. "That was war!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "We were soldiers following orders." The excuse sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Orders?" Grace's voice turned cold as winter frost. "Was it orders that made you pretend to be deserters, to gain those men's trust before leading them to slaughter? No, James. That was choice, your choice, and now it's time to answer for it." A shot rang out. One of the hired guns, his nerve breaking, had fired first. The bullet kicked up dust near Grace's feet, but he hadn't flinched. Instead, his right hand moved with devastating speed. The Remington seemed to materialize in his grip, and before the echo of the first shot had died, the hired gun toppled from his saddle, a perfect hole where his heart had been. The street erupted into chaos. The remaining hired guns opened fire, but Grace was already moving. His first shot caught Frank Mackenzie's horse in the chest, sending the middle brother sprawling. His second dropped 2 mercenaries who had tried to flank him, the double-action Remington barking twice in rapid succession. Sarah Cooper and the townspeople opened fire from their positions, their shots forcing the hired guns to scatter. Old Tom Wilson's Henry repeater spoke with authority, proving that age hadn't dimmed his marksmanship. Dr. Morrison's surgical precision with his Sharps carbine added to the deadly crossfire. But it was Grace who commanded the battle. Each movement was calculated, each shot deliberate. He seemed to flow between points of cover like smoke, appearing just long enough to send another soul to judgment before vanishing again. The hired guns, used to brutal but straightforward fights, found themselves facing an opponent who turned the very geography of the town into a weapon. "Remember what I taught you about bread dough, Mrs. Cooper?" Grace called out as he reloaded with practiced ease. "How you have to work it just right to develop the proper structure." A quick pivot brought his Remington to bear on 2 mercenaries trying to circle behind the general store. 2 shots, 2 bodies hit the dust. Justice works the same way. You have to build it carefully, step by step. James Mackenzie watched in horror as his hired army began to crumble. Ghost Eyes wasn't just killing them, he was demoralizing them, making each death a lesson in inevitability. Some of the mercenaries were already turning their horses, deciding that no amount of money was worth facing this phantom from the war. Bill Mackenzie, in a panic, spurred his horse toward the bank, seeking better cover. Grace's shot took the horse out from under him with surgical precision, sending the youngest brother crashing through the bank's front window. The message was clear. The Mackenzies wouldn't be allowed to escape justice this time. "You've got nowhere to run now," Grace announced, his voice carrying over the diminishing gunfire. "No more hiding behind hired guns. No more escaping to build new empires of fear." He moved like flowing water through the street, each step placing him exactly where he needed to be. 13 years ago, you murdered 243 good men. I've spent every day since then making sure their deaths would be avenged. The sun had finally set, but the street remained illuminated by muzzle flashes and the fires that had broken out during the fighting. The townspeople maintained their positions, picking off any hired guns who tried to outflank their defender. But the real battle, they knew, was between Grace and the Mackenzie brothers, a reckoning 13 years in the making. As darkness settled over Millbrook Valley, the baker, who had served the town its daily bread, continued his deadly work. Each shot was measured as carefully as a cup of flour, each movement precise as a master chef's knife work. The Mackenzie brothers' day of judgment had finally arrived, served hot and fresh by the deadliest baker in the West. James Mackenzie crouched behind an overturned wagon, his once immaculate coat now stained with dust and blood. Around him, the remnants of his hired army were discovering what Confederate soldiers had learned 13 years ago. There was no hiding from Ghost Eyes. Every attempt at counterattack had been met with devastating precision. Each strategy countered before it could fully develop. "Get word to the ranch," he hissed to one of his remaining men. "Tell Edwards to bring the Gatling gun." The mercenary's eyes widened at the mention of the weapon. The Mackenzies had acquired the devastating machine gun for an exorbitant sum, saving it for situations that required overwhelming force. If Ghost Eyes wanted a reckoning, they'd give him one that would be remembered for generations. Inside his ruined bakery, Grace methodically reloaded his weapons. The air still carried the scent of fresh bread, now mixed with gun smoke. Sarah Cooper worked beside him, feeding cartridges into her husband Springfield with steady hands. "They're pulling back," she reported, peering through a shattered window, regrouping near the livery stable. "Not retreating," Grace corrected, checking the alignment of his rifle's sights. James Mackenzie never retreats. He escalates. His ghost-pale eyes narrowed slightly. They'll have something in reserve, something they think will change the equation. He turned to Marshal Harper, who was tending to a minor wound. "The ranch. What heavy weapons do they have stored there?" Harper's face paled. There were rumors. A Gatling gun, brought in 6 months ago, never been used. The implications hung heavy in the air. A Gatling gun could turn Millbrook Valley's main street into a killing field, negating even Grace's legendary marksmanship through sheer volume of fire. "Perfect," Grace said softly, surprising them all. At their questioning looks, he elaborated, "A Gatling gun is impressive, but it has 2 critical weaknesses. First, it requires a team to operate effectively. Second, and more importantly, it has to be stationary to be accurate." A slight smile crossed his features. "They're about to bunch up all their remaining forces around a fixed position. Exactly what a sharpshooter dreams of." Outside, Frank Mackenzie had managed to regroup with his brothers behind the livery stable. His leg was bleeding where Grace's shot had grazed him during the initial exchange. "We should cut our losses," he argued desperately. "Ghost Eyes isn't just fighting for revenge, he's fighting for justice. That makes him more dangerous than any 10 men. Shut up." James snarled, his composure finally cracking. "I didn't spend 13 years building this empire to let one man tear it down. Once the Gatling gun arrives, we'll turn that whole street into a graveyard. Let's see how ghostly he looks with 50 bullets in him." Bill Mackenzie, the youngest, nursed his injuries from the fall through the bank window. "The town's turned against us," he observed. "Even if we kill Grace, we've lost Millbrook Valley. They'll never fear us the same way again." James grabbed his younger brother by the collar. "Fear isn't given, it's taken. Once Ghost Eyes is dead, we'll make an example of this town that the whole territory will remember. Every man, woman, and child who stood with him will learn what it means to defy the Mackenzies." In the gathering darkness, the sound of heavy wheels approaching drew everyone's attention. Edwards and 4 men were approaching from the ranch, laboriously maneuvering the Gatling gun into position. The formidable weapon, mounted on a modified wagon chassis, represented the Mackenzies' last, best hope of overcoming their nemesis. Grace watched the weapon's arrival through his rifle scope, making precise mental calculations. "Mrs. Cooper," he said quietly, "get word to everyone. When that gun opens up, no one is to return fire. Let them think they've won. Let them commit fully to their position." He turned to Harper. "Remember Missionary Ridge? How we handled that Confederate battery?" The marshal nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The gun crew first, then the ammunition wagon, then the command element. Create chaos, then exploit it. He studied his old friend's face. That was with a full squad of sharpshooters. You're attempting it alone. Not alone, Grace corrected, nodding toward the townsfolk who had stood with him. We have something better than a squad of sharpshooters. We have people fighting for their homes, their freedom. He checked his ammunition one final time. Besides, a good baker knows that sometimes the most impressive results come from the simplest recipes. The Gatling gun was slowly brought into position, its multiple barrels gleaming menacingly in the last light of day. James Mackenzie stood behind it, his confidence returning as he surveyed the devastating weapon. "Ghost eyes!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the bullet-scarred street. "Last chance to die quickly. Surrender now, or we turn this street into hell itself." Grace's response was characteristic of the man. No words, just action. A single shot rang out, and the gun crew's ammunition bearer dropped, the critical box of belted ammunition falling from lifeless hands. The message was clear. The game wasn't over. It was merely entering its final, deadliest phase. As the sun's last rays faded from Millbrook Valley, both sides prepared for what would be the battle's decisive moment. The Mackenzies had brought the ultimate weapon of wholesale slaughter, but they faced a man who had turned single, precise shots into an art form, a baker who measured death with the same exacting standards he used for his finest recipes. Darkness had settled over Millbrook Valley like a burial shroud, broken only by the scattered fires that illuminated the battlefield the town had become. The Gatling gun's multiple barrels caught the firelight, casting serpentine shadows across the street. Behind it, James Mackenzie positioned his remaining men with desperate precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn any approach into a killing zone. Grace observed these preparations from his position in the ruined bakery, his ghost-pale eyes noting every detail. The first shot that had killed the ammunition bearer had served its purpose, sowing confusion and forcing the Mackenzies to commit more men to protect their devastating weapon. Now those men were clustered around the gun, like ingredients waiting to be mixed into a deadly recipe. "You see that wagon to the left of the gun?" Grace asked Marshal Harper quietly. "The one with the canvas cover? That's their main ammunition supply? They'll have loaded the gun with one belt, but the rest will be stored there, protected from stray sparks." His voice carried the same methodical tone he used when explaining the proper way to proof dough. Sarah Cooper moved silently through the shadows, passing Grace's observations to the other townspeople who had taken up defensive positions. The message was clear. When the time came, the ammunition wagon would need to be eliminated. But first, the Mackenzies had to be drawn into committing fully to their position. "Ghost eyes!" James Mackenzie's voice carried across the bullet-scarred street. "You've got nowhere left to run. This gun will tear through every building in town until we find you." To emphasize his point, he ordered a short burst from the Gatling gun. The weapon roared to life, its multiple barrels spitting lead in a devastating arc that shredded the front of the general store. The thunderous display had its intended effect. Several of the townspeople instinctively ducked lower behind their cover, awed and terrified by the weapon's destructive power. But Grace remained unmoved, watching the gun crew's operations with professional interest. "Notice how the loader has to stand to feed the ammunition belt," he commented to Harper. "Makes him vulnerable from above. And see how the gunner has to expose his right side to operate the crank? Poor design for someone worried about counterfire." James Mackenzie's confidence grew with each passing moment that brought no response from his nemesis. "One last chance, Ghost Eyes. Show yourself now, or we start systematically destroying this town, building by building." To demonstrate his resolve, he ordered another burst, this time targeting the church steeple that might have served as a sniper's perch. Grace's response came not in words, but in action. A single shot rang out, and one of the gun crew pitched forward across the weapon, his body jamming the firing mechanism. Before the Mackenzies could react, a second shot found the loader, dropping him beside his fallen comrade. Each bullet had found its mark with surgical precision, turning the Gatling gun from an instrument of destruction into an expensive obstacle. The night erupted into chaos. The Mackenzies' men, realizing their supposedly overwhelming advantage had been neutralized, began firing wildly into the darkness. Grace's carefully placed shots picked them off one by one, each crack of his rifle marking another soul sent to judgment. The townspeople, following his earlier instructions, held their fire, allowing the mercenaries to waste ammunition shooting at shadows. 13 years ago, Grace's voice carried across the battlefield, as calm as if he were discussing the weather. You led 243 men into a trap through treachery. Tonight, you've led 30 men to their deaths through arrogance. Another shot rang out, claiming another hired gun. The difference is, these men chose to stand with you knowing what you were. That makes their fate a matter of justice, not just vengeance. Bill Mackenzie, panic finally overwhelming him, broke from cover and made a desperate run for his horse. Grace's shot took him in the leg, dropping him in the street. The message was clear. The Mackenzie brothers wouldn't be allowed a quick death. They would face judgment for their crimes, one painful step at a time. Frank Mackenzie tried to provide covering fire for his fallen brother, but his shots went wide, betraying his growing terror. They had faced skilled gunmen before, had overcome seemingly impossible odds through superior numbers and firepower. But this was different. This wasn't a gunfight. It was an execution, methodically carried out by a man who had spent 13 years planning every detail. You want to know something interesting about baking bread? Grace's voice cut through the sporadic gunfire. The most important ingredient isn't the flour or the yeast or even the water, it's time. Without proper time, nothing rises correctly. A shot punctuated his words, claiming another mercenary who had tried to reach the ammunition wagon. Justice is the same way. It needs time to develop properly. 13 years might seem like a long wait, but for something this important, you can't rush the process. James Mackenzie felt his control over the situation slipping away with each crack of Grace's rifle. The Gatling gun, his trump card, now stood useless in the street, its dead crew a testament to the futility of trying to outfight a legend. His remaining men were being picked off with the same methodical precision that had terrorized Confederate forces during the war. As if reading his thoughts, Grace's voice carried one final observation. You know what else baking and justice have in common, James? In the end, everyone gets their just desserts. The fires burning throughout Millbrook Valley cast an infernal glow over the battlefield, transforming the once peaceful Main Street into something resembling the hell James Mackenzie had promised. The disabled Gatling gun stood as a monument to failed intimidation, its dead crew a testament to Ghost Eye's lethal precision. But the Mackenzies had one last card to play, born of desperate cunning and years of ruthless survival. "Bring out the woman!" James Mackenzie's voice carried across the bullet-scarred street. From behind the livery stable, two of his remaining men dragged forward a struggling figure, Martha Wilson, old Tom's daughter, who had been working late at the schoolhouse when the fighting began. The old barber's sharp intake of breath told Grace all he needed to know about the stakes that had just been raised. "See, Ghost Eyes," James called out, his voice carrying a hint of hysteria beneath its attempted bravado. "This is the difference between us. You've spent 13 years planning revenge, but I've spent that time learning how to win. Now show yourself, or the schoolteacher learns firsthand how we dealt with traitors during the war." Grace stood motionless in the shadows of his ruined bakery, his ghost-pale eyes calculating distances and angles with mechanical precision. The situation had shifted dramatically. His carefully laid trap had been reversed, forcing him to consider options that all carried terrible risks. "He's bluffing," Marshal Harper whispered urgently. "The moment you show yourself, they'll kill you both." The marshal had seen this scenario play out before during their war days, had watched good men die, trying to save hostages from desperate men. Perhaps Grace replied softly. But sometimes the ingredients you're forced to work with aren't the ones you'd choose. His mind worked through the problem like a complex recipe, measuring distances instead of flour, calculating trajectories instead of baking times. Mrs. Cooper, your husband's rifle, how many rounds do you have left? Sarah checked her ammunition. 6 shots, she reported, but I can't guarantee accuracy at this distance, not in this light. Her hands were steady, but her voice carried the weight of understanding what failure would mean. Grace nodded, as if confirming something he'd already known. "Old Tom," he called quietly to the barber. "Your daughter. Does she still have that habit of fainting at the sight of blood?" The old man's eyes widened as he caught the implication, remembering how Martha had once passed out during a minor cutting accident at his shop. "Every time," Tom confirmed, a glimmer of hope entering his voice. "Even a nosebleed sends her down like a felled tree." "Good," Grace said, his voice carrying the same calm precision he used when explaining the perfect temperature for proofing dough. "Because what's about to happen will require perfect timing from everyone. Mrs. Cooper, when I give the signal, I need you to shoot the oil lamp hanging above the stable door. Don't hit the hostage takers, just the lamp. The flames will provide both distraction and illumination." He turned to Harper. "Marshall, remember that trick shot competition in Virginia? The one where I ricocheted a bullet off a brass button to hit a target behind cover?" The marshal nodded, realization dawning in his eyes. "Same principle, but this time the target is the large brass buckle on James Mackenzie's gun belt. One shot to create a spark, another to take advantage of Martha's tendency to faint, and a third to end this once and for all." James Mackenzie's patience was wearing thin. "Final warning, Ghost Eyes. Show yourself now, or—" His threat was cut short by the sound of footsteps. From the shadows of the ruined bakery emerged Thomas Grace, his hands held away from his weapons, flour still dusting his clothes despite the night's violence. "Here I am, James," Grace called out, his voice carrying across the battlefield like judgment itself. "Let's discuss this like civilized men. After all, we both learned our trade in the same war." He moved forward with measured steps, each movement calculated to draw attention away from the other players in this deadly drama. Frank Mackenzie, supporting his wounded brother Bill, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. He had seen that look before, 13 years ago in a blood-soaked valley. It was the look of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome, who had measured each angle as precisely as a baker measuring ingredients. "Stop right there!" James commanded, pressing his gun against Martha's temple. The schoolteacher trembled, but remained conscious, though Grace noted the paleness of her face with professional interest. Everything was proceeding according to his carefully measured recipe for justice. "You know what the secret is to dealing with a hostage situation, James?" Grace asked conversationally, still moving forward with measured steps. "It's like baking a soufflé. Timing is everything. Too soon, it falls flat. Too late, and everything burns." His ghost-pale eyes met Martha's, conveying a message of calm reassurance. The trick is knowing exactly when to apply the heat. The signal was so subtle that only those watching for it would have noticed. A slight tilt of Grace's head, almost imperceptible in the firelight. Sarah Cooper's shot shattered the oil lamp above the stable door, sending burning kerosene cascading down. In the same instant, Grace's first shot struck James Mackenzie's belt buckle, creating a spark that caught Martha's eye. Right on cue, the schoolteacher's eyes rolled back, her sudden dead weight throwing off her captor's aim. What followed was a demonstration of marksmanship that would be talked about for generations. 3 shots rang out in such rapid succession that they seemed like a single report. 3 men fell, their guns unfired, their final expressions registering surprise rather than pain. The hostage-takers dropped first, followed by James Mackenzie himself, the legendary Ghost Eyes having calculated and executed a series of shots that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The smoke from Grace's rifle had barely cleared when the implications of what had just occurred began to register across Millbrook Valley. James Mackenzie, the architect of so much suffering, lay motionless in the street, his final expression one of disbelief that anyone could make such impossible shots. The remaining hired guns, witnessing their employer's fall, threw down their weapons with such haste that the clatter of surrendering arms sounded like rainfall on a tin roof. Martha Wilson, recovering from her faint, found herself safely cradled in her father's arms, while Grace methodically reloaded his weapon. His movements remained precise and measured, as if he was still in his bakery preparing the morning's first batch of bread. The ghost-pale eyes that had earned him his wartime name swept the battlefield, ensuring that no threat remained overlooked. "You know what the most important moment in baking is?" Grace asked quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "It's not when you put the bread in the oven, or even when you take it out. It's the moment you check to make sure it's done properly." He moved toward the fallen James Mackenzie with the same deliberate pace that had marked his every action. The same principle applies to justice. Frank Mackenzie, still supporting his wounded brother Bill, watched in horror as Grace approached. The legendary marksman's reputation had, if anything, understated his capabilities. 3 seemingly impossible shots had dismantled their final desperate gambit as easily as if he'd been shooting targets at a county fair. "Please," Frank began, his voice cracking, "we can make a deal. We have money, properties across the territory." His plea was cut short by Grace's raised hand. "Interesting choice of words," Grace observed, his tone remaining as measured as when he discussed proper kneading techniques. 13 years ago, your brother used the word deal when he convinced those Union soldiers to trust him. Promised them safe passage through Confederate lines in exchange for their weapons. His ghost-pale eyes fixed on Frank with the same intensity that had once terrorized Confederate forces. 243 men died because they believed in deals. Marshal Harper approached, leading a group of townspeople who were securing the surrendered mercenaries. "James is still breathing," he reported, checking the fallen gang leader. "Your shot placed exactly where you said it would. Through the shoulder, painful, but not immediately fatal." Grace nodded, as if this was precisely what he'd intended. "Good. Justice isn't just about ending lives, Marshal. It's about ensuring that those who deserve punishment live long enough to face it properly." He turned to address the gathered citizens of Millbrook Valley. "These men will stand trial for their crimes, not just their actions here, but for the massacre at Chancellorsville. The Territory Marshal's office has been building a case for months, waiting for the right moment to move." Sarah Cooper stepped forward, Robert's rifle still held ready. "And what about their empire of fear, the properties they've stolen, the lives they've ruined?" The question carried the weight of personal loss, of her husband's murder, and all the other injustices the Mackenzies had inflicted. "Like any good recipe," Grace replied, "justice has multiple steps. The territorial courts will handle the Mackenzies' crimes here in the West, but I've arranged for them to face military justice as well for their actions during the war. Sometimes the most satisfying meals require careful preparation at multiple stages." The wounded James Mackenzie, consciousness returning, looked up at the man who had haunted his nightmares for 13 years. "You could have killed me with that shot," he managed through clenched teeth. "Why didn't you?" Grace knelt beside his fallen enemy, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when explaining the complexities of French pastry. "Because death is quick, James. Justice takes time. You're going to live long enough to face the families of every man you betrayed at Chancellorsville. You're going to stand trial before both civilian and military courts. And when they finally execute you, it won't be as a feared gang leader who died in a blaze of glory. It will be as a convicted traitor who faced the consequences of his actions. The first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, illuminating a transformed Millbrook Valley. The Mackenzie brothers' reign of terror had ended not with the dramatic gunfight they'd imagined, but with surgical precision from a man who approached justice with the same exacting standards he applied to his baking. Old Tom Wilson, supporting his shaken but recovering daughter, watched as Grace began issuing instructions for securing the prisoners. "Will you stay?" he asked the legendary marksman. "The town could use a man like you, and your baking." Grace's slight smile carried a hint of warmth that his eyes had lacked during the confrontation. "A good baker knows when his work is done, Mr. Wilson. The Mackenzies will face justice, their empire will be dismantled, and the money they stole will be returned to its rightful owners." He looked around at the town that had stood with him. "But more importantly, Millbrook Valley has found its courage. You don't need a ghost from the past watching over you anymore." As the morning sun rose fully over the horizon, Thomas Ghost Eyes Grace returned to his bullet-scarred bakery. Despite the night's violence, he began preparing dough for the day's bread with the same precise movements that had just delivered long-delayed justice. After all, he mused, both baking and justice required the same essential ingredients: patience, precision, and the understanding that anything worth doing was worth doing properly. As morning light filtered through the bullet-scarred windows of the Mackenzie mansion, Marshal Harper led a team of townspeople through its opulent rooms. Grace moved methodically through the study, his baker's attention to detail now focused on uncovering evidence of the brothers' crimes. Each drawer, each hidden compartment, each seemingly innocent document received the same careful scrutiny he usually reserved for measuring ingredients. "Over here," Sarah Cooper called from behind a massive oak desk. She had discovered a hidden lever that, when pulled, revealed a concealed compartment. Inside lay leather-bound ledgers documenting years of extortion, theft, and murder, and Grace examined them with the same precision he used when checking his recipes for accuracy. 13 years of corruption, he observed, carefully turning the pages. Every transaction, every threat, every life they took, all recorded with banker's precision. His ghost-pale eyes narrowed as he found a particular entry, including the order for Robert Cooper's murder, Mrs. Cooper, signed in James Mackenzie's own hand. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the ledger, reading the cold accounting of her husband's death. The entry was sandwiched between notes about protection payments and property seizures, as if taking a man's life was just another business transaction. "They'll pay for this," she said quietly. "All of it." Dr. Morrison, who had joined the search team, discovered a locked cabinet in the mansion's basement. Inside, they found something that made even Grace pause: hundreds of letters, testimonies, and military documents from the Civil War. The Mackenzie brothers hadn't just changed their name after Chancellorsville. They had systematically erased their previous identities. "Look at this," Morrison said, holding up a yellow document. "Orders from Confederate High Command, specifically authorizing the McKinnon brothers to conduct deception operations. They weren't just acting on their own. They were part of a larger operation targeting Union forces." Grace took the document, his expression unchanged, but his eyes burning with intensified purpose. "This goes beyond Chancellorsville," he noted. "The McKinnons conducted similar operations across Virginia and Maryland, hundreds more deaths, all carefully documented." He turned to Harper. "These records will ensure they face military justice as well as territorial law." In town, Frank Mackenzie, secured in the jail's strongest cell, finally broke under the weight of his crimes. He began talking, revealing details about operations even Grace hadn't uncovered. The middle brother spoke of hidden caches of stolen money, of deals with corrupt officials, of other massacres conducted during and after the war. James kept records of everything, Frank revealed, his voice hollow with defeat. Said it was insurance in case any of our allies tried to turn against us. There's a second set of books hidden in the old silver mine. Details about every judge we bribed, every marshal we paid off, every politician we owned. Grace dispatched riders to the mine immediately, their horses kicking up dust as they raced to secure this new evidence. He remained in the mansion's study, continuing his methodical search with the same patience he applied to perfecting a difficult pastry. "You know what the most crucial step in baking is?" he asked Sarah Cooper as they worked. "Documentation, keeping precise records of what works, what doesn't, how each ingredient affects the final product." He held up another ledger. The Mackenzies applied that same principle to their crimes. Their own meticulous record-keeping will be their undoing. Old Tom Wilson arrived with news from town. The territorial marshal's office had telegraphed confirmation. Federal agents were already en route, along with military investigators interested in the Chancellorsville massacre. The Mackenzie brothers' day of reckoning wouldn't be limited to their crimes in Millbrook Valley. James Mackenzie, under heavy guard in Dr. Morrison's surgery, listened to the sound of his empire crumbling. Each new discovery, each revealed document, each exposed conspiracy stripped away another layer of the fearsome reputation he'd spent 13 years building. "I don't understand," he said when Grace visited him. "You had 13 years to plan your revenge. Why involve the law? Why not just kill us when you had the chance?" Grace's response carried the measured tone of a man explaining the importance of proper temperature in bread baking. "Because revenge ends with death, James. Justice lives on. Your detailed records will help dismantle corrupt networks across the territory. Your trial will bring closure to hundreds of families. Your carefully documented crimes will serve as evidence to convict dozens of corrupt officials." Doomed, the riders returned from the silver mine with saddlebags full of additional documents. Just as Frank had revealed, the second set of books contained evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Grace examined these new records with the same methodical care he used when testing the freshness of ingredients. "Each piece of evidence," he explained to the gathered townspeople, "is like an ingredient in a complex recipe. Alone, they might seem insignificant, but combined properly, in the right proportions and sequence, they create something powerful." Jeudi, he began organizing the documents with precise movements. The Mackenzies didn't just build an empire of fear. They created a perfect record of their own crimes, thinking it would protect them through blackmail. Instead, it will ensure justice is served not just to them, but to everyone who enabled their reign of terror. As the sun climbed higher over Millbrook Valley, Grace's patient, methodical approach began bearing fruit. Telegraph wires hummed with messages to law enforcement agencies across the territory. The evidence uncovered in the mansion and mine would trigger investigations that would last for years, reaching into every corner of corruption the Mackenzies had touched. The sound of approaching horsemen drew the attention of Millbrook Valley's citizens as a contingent of territorial marshals rode into town, led by Chief Marshal Benjamin Hawkins himself. The morning sun glinted off their badges as they surveyed the aftermath of the previous night's battle. Bullet holes scarred buildings. The disabled Gatling gun still stood as a grim monument, and the air carried the lingering scent of gun smoke mixed with fresh bread from Grace's partially destroyed bakery. "Quite a mess you've stirred up here, Ghost Eyes," Hawkins remarked as he dismounted. He was a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough frontier justice to know the difference between vengeance and righteousness. "Though I suppose we shouldn't call you that anymore. These days, you're just the baker who makes the best sourdough west of the Mississippi." Grace continued kneading dough at his makeshift workstation, set up in the undamaged portion of his bakery. His movements remained precise and measured, even as he addressed the Chief Marshal. "The name doesn't matter, Marshal Hawkins. What matters is the evidence we've uncovered. The Mackenzie's records detail corruption reaching into every corner of the territory." Hawkins nodded gravely, producing a stack of telegrams from his saddlebag. "We've already begun acting on the information you sent ahead. 3 judges have been arrested this morning. 2 more have fled, though they won't get far. The Mackenzie's insurance policy is turning out to be quite the powder keg." Marshal Harper approached, carrying another ledger discovered in the mansion's hidden vault. "Chief Marshal, you'll want to see this. Names, dates, amounts. Every bribe they paid, every official they bought. Some of these transactions go back to just after the war, when they first arrived in the territory. The Chief Marshal's men spread throughout the town, securing evidence and taking statements from witnesses. They worked with the same methodical precision that Grace applied to his baking, ensuring that every detail was properly documented and verified. The Mackenzie brothers' trial would need to be ironclad, leaving no room for their corrupt allies to engineer an escape from justice. In the town jail, James Mackenzie received a visitor, Colonel Augustus Winchester of the Army's Judge Advocate General's office. The military prosecutor had ridden through the night after receiving word of the Mackenzies' capture, bringing with him the full weight of military justice. "Private Thomas Grace," the colonel mused, studying James through the cell bars, "one of the finest marksmen ever to serve the Union cause. When he approached me 6 months ago with his suspicions about your true identity, I could hardly believe the McKinnon brothers had been hiding in plain sight all these years." James Mackenzie's face drained of color at the mention of his true name. "The war's been over for 13 years, he protested weakly. "You can't still. There's no statute of limitations on wartime treachery," Winchester cut him off sharply. 243 men died at Chancellorsville because they trusted your lies. Their families have waited 13 years for justice. Thanks to Mr. Grace's patience and precision, that wait is finally over. Sarah Cooper worked alongside the territorial marshals, helping to organize the evidence from her general store. Each document reminded her of Robert, of how he had stood alone against the Mackenzies' tyranny. "He knew, didn't he?" she asked Grace, as he inspected a fresh batch of bread. "When you first arrived in town, Robert suspected you were more than just a baker." Grace nodded slightly, his ghost-pale eyes softening at the mention of her late husband. "He approached me the second week I was here, said he recognized something in the way I moved, the way I watched everything. He offered to help, to stand with me when the time came." His voice carried a rare note of regret. "I told him to wait, that I had a plan in motion. 3 days later, the Mackenzies killed him." Chief Marshal Hawkins overheard this exchange as he reviewed another ledger. "Robert Cooper's murder was the catalyst that finally set our plans in motion. His death proved the Mackenzies were getting careless, overconfident. It gave us the opening we needed to begin dismantling their network of corruption." The sound of more approaching riders heralded the arrival of additional federal agents, including Treasury investigators interested in the Mackenzies' financial crimes. The quiet frontier town had become the center of an investigation that would reshape the territory's power structure. "You know what the secret is to making perfect bread?" Grace asked, as he watched the authorities processing the evidence he had spent 13 years gathering. "Patience. Understanding that each step, each ingredient, each minute of preparation serves a purpose. Rush any part of the process, and the entire recipe fails." Hawkins understood the metaphor. 13 years is a long time to wait for justice, Ghost Eyes. Lesser men would have settled for revenge. Grace's response carried the same precision as his measurements for the day's baking. "Revenge is like a quick meal, temporarily satisfying but ultimately unfulfilling. Justice, properly prepared, nourishes the entire community. The Mackenzies' downfall won't just bring peace to the victims of Chancellorsville, it will help cleanse corruption from the entire territory. As morning turned to afternoon, the full scope of Grace's patient work became clear. The Mackenzie brothers hadn't just been captured. Their entire corrupt empire had been systematically documented, creating a web of evidence that would bring down dozens of collaborators. The legendary marksman had traded his rifle for a rolling pin, but his precision and patience had proven just as deadly to the cancer of corruption as his marksmanship had been to Confederate forces. The transformation of Millbrook Valley began with the same methodical precision that Thomas Grace applied to his baking. As federal agents continued processing evidence from the Mackenzie mansion, the town council convened an emergency session in the bullet-scarred town hall. Grace attended, still wearing his flour-dusted apron, his ghost-pale eyes watching as the community he had helped liberate took its first steps toward proper governance. Mayor Frederick Drummond, chastened by his previous compliance with the Mackenzies' corruption, stood before the assembled citizens. "For too long, we allowed fear to dictate our actions," he admitted, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "Mr. Grace has shown us that standing against tyranny requires more than just courage. It requires careful preparation and unwavering dedication to justice." Sarah Cooper, newly appointed to the town council to replace one of the Mackenzies' corrupt allies, presented a comprehensive plan for redistributing stolen properties to their rightful owners. The ledgers discovered in the mansion provided exact records of every property seized through intimidation or fraud. "Like measuring ingredients for a complex recipe," she noted, nodding to Grace, "returning what was stolen requires precise attention to detail." Chief Marshal Hawkins observed these proceedings with approval. The territorial government had already dispatched legal experts to help Millbrook Valley establish proper systems of governance. "A town's transformation," he remarked to Grace, "is not unlike your baking process. Each element must be carefully measured, properly combined, and given time to develop." Grace watched as old Tom Wilson presented evidence of systematized corruption in the town's tax collection. The barber had kept secret records of the Mackenzies' extortion hidden beneath the floorboards of his shop. "Did you know about his records?" Hawkins asked the baker-turned-avenger. "Every ingredient serves its purpose," Grace replied, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when discussing proper fermentation times. Tom's documentation provides independent verification of the Mackenzies' crimes. Combined with their own records, it creates an unbreakable chain of evidence. Outside the town hall, federal agents supervised the cataloging of the Mackenzie brothers' considerable arsenal. The Gatling gun, still standing where it had failed to turn the tide of battle, would be sent to the territorial capital as evidence. Marshal Harper oversaw the process, ensuring each weapon was properly documented. "You know what's remarkable about bread making?" Grace asked as he watched the proceedings. "The transformation. Simple ingredients, properly combined and given time, become something entirely new. The same principle applies to justice. Each piece of evidence, each witness statement, each recovered document, they combine to transform a corrupt system into something that serves the community." Dr. Morrison, treating the wounded from the previous night's conflict, reported that James Mackenzie would survive to face trial. "Though I suspect," the doctor added with grim satisfaction, "he'll wish otherwise once the military tribunal begins its proceedings." The transformation extended beyond mere governance. Citizens who had lived in fear of the Mackenzies began reclaiming their dignity. Shop owners removed the signs that had marked them as paying protection money. Miners, who had been forced to sell their claims at a fraction of their worth, began legal proceedings to reclaim their properties. Colonel Winchester, reviewing the military aspects of the case, expressed amazement at Grace's patience. 13 years of preparation, he mused, studying the baker's methodical movements. "You could have simply shot them at any time. Why such an elaborate plan?" Grace continued preparing dough for the afternoon's baking, as he replied, "Justice, properly served, requires more than just eliminating the guilty. It requires healing the system that allowed their crimes to flourish. Like a proper sourdough starter, it needs time to develop the right culture." Sarah Cooper, examining property records in the town clerk's office, discovered the full extent of the Mackenzies' corruption. They hadn't just stolen property. They had systematically rewritten the town's history, altering documents to legitimize their theft. "We'll need to verify every land deed," she announced. "Every contract, every transaction from the past 13 years. "Start with the foundations," Grace advised, applying the same principle he used in teaching proper baking techniques. Like building a proper loaf, you need to ensure the base is solid before adding complexity. The afternoon brought more changes as territorial officials began implementing emergency measures to stabilize the region's governance. Banks that had facilitated the Mackenzies' financial crimes were placed under federal supervision. Corrupt officials who had enabled their reign were suspended pending investigation. Through it all, Grace maintained his baker's routine, preparing bread and pastries with the same precision he had applied to dismantling the Mackenzies' empire. "A community," he observed to Marshal Harper, "is like a well-maintained starter culture. It requires regular attention, proper conditions, and occasional renewal to remain healthy." As evening approached, the citizens of Millbrook Valley gathered in the town square to discuss plans for rebuilding damaged structures. The bullet holes and fire damage would be repaired, but some marks would be preserved, reminders of the night when a baker's precision had helped deliver justice 13 years in the making. As the federal investigation deepened, the full scope of the Mackenzies' crimes emerged like layers of sediment in an archaeological dig. Each new revelation proved more damning than the last. In the town hall's main chamber, Chief Marshal Hawkins presided over the preliminary hearing that would determine the extent of charges against the brothers. Grace sat quietly in the back of the room, still wearing his flour-dusted apron, watching as 13 years of careful preparation bore fruit. Sarah Cooper presented evidence of systematic property theft, her voice steady as she detailed how the Mackenzies had built their empire on stolen dreams and broken lives. "The pattern becomes clear," she explained, spreading documents across the hearing table. "They would identify prosperous businesses or valuable mining claims, then would come the threats, the escalating violence, and finally, the forced sales at pennies on the dollar." She held up one of the ledgers from the mansion. "They recorded everything, treating people's livelihoods like entries in a cookbook." James Mackenzie, seated between two federal marshals, his shoulder still bandaged from Grace's precise shot, watched his carefully constructed world crumble. Each witness brought forward another piece of the puzzle he had thought safely buried. Old Tom Wilson testified about the protection racket that had bled the town's businesses dry. Dr. Morrison presented medical records of victims who had suffered the Mackenzies' demonstrations of authority. Colonel Winchester, representing the military's interests, introduced the most damning evidence yet. "Beyond their crimes in the territory," he announced, producing weathered military documents, "we have conclusive proof linking the Mackenzie brothers, or rather the McKinnon brothers, to 6 other massacres similar to Chancellorsville. Their deception operations led to the deaths of over 800 Union soldiers during the war." Frank Mackenzie, his composure finally breaking, stood to address the hearing. "We want to make a deal," he began, but Grace's quiet voice cut through his desperate plea. "Like the deal you offered those soldiers at Chancellorsville?" The baker's ghost-pale eyes fixed on the middle brother. "Or the deal you offered Robert Cooper before you murdered him?" Grace stood, his movement drawing every eye in the room. Some crimes can't be bargained away, Frank. Some debts can only be paid in full. Chief Marshal Hawkins nodded gravely. Mr. Grace is correct. The evidence we've uncovered goes beyond simple criminal behavior. We're looking at systematic corruption, multiple murders, wartime treason, and crimes against the very fabric of justice itself. Bill Mackenzie, the youngest brother, slumped in his chair as federal agents presented evidence of his role in intimidating witnesses and eliminating threats to the family's operations. His carefully cultivated image as the family's wild younger son dissolved, replaced by documented proof of calculated brutality. "You want to know the most important part of baking?" Grace asked, addressing the gathered assembly. "It's not the ingredients or even the technique. It's accountability. Every step must be precise, every measurement exact, because in the end, the results speak for themselves." He gestured to the mountain of evidence before them. The Mackenzies kept perfect records of their crimes, thinking documentation would protect them. Instead, they wrote their own indictment. Marshal Harper brought forward the latest discoveries from the silver mine. Hidden correspondence revealing connections to corrupt officials across 3 territories. The Mackenzies' insurance policy had backfired spectacularly, providing investigators with a roadmap of corruption that would take years to fully unravel. "Like a proper sourdough starter," Grace observed, as another damning piece of evidence was presented. Corruption spreads through a system until it's properly cleansed. The Mackenzies didn't just poison Millbrook Valley, they infected every institution they touched. James Mackenzie, watching his carefully constructed facade of legitimacy collapse, finally understood the full scope of Grace's revenge. The baker hadn't just waited 13 years to kill them. He had spent that time ensuring their complete destruction. Every aspect of their lives, every crime, every secret would be exposed to the harsh light of justice. "The territorial court will convene next week," Chief Marshal Hawkins announced. "Following that, the military tribunal will address the wartime charges. Given the extent of evidence and the severity of the crimes, I think we can all anticipate the outcome." Sarah Cooper, completing her presentation of financial evidence, revealed the final tally of the Mackenzies' theft from Millbrook Valley alone. Over $2 million in stolen property and extorted funds. "Every penny will be traced," she promised the assembled citizens. "Every stolen property returned, every victim compensated." As the hearing concluded, Grace returned to his partially rebuilt bakery. The afternoon sun streamed through new windows, illuminating the fresh-baked loaves cooling on their racks. The scent of honest work replaced the lingering smell of gun smoke and corruption. "Justice," he remarked to Marshal Harper, who had followed him, "is like baking bread. The process requires patience, precision, and above all, the right conditions to rise properly. For 13 years, I helped prepare those conditions. Now, we all get to see the final product." 1 week after the Mackenzies' downfall, Thomas Grace stood in his rebuilt bakery, examining the fresh paint and new fixtures that had replaced the bullet-scarred walls. The morning sun streamed through pristine windows, illuminating the shelves of fresh bread and pastries that once again filled the establishment. Outside, the sounds of construction echoed through Millbrook Valley as the town continued its restoration. Marshal Harper entered, bringing news from the territorial capital. "The first round of trials begins tomorrow," he reported, accepting a freshly baked roll. "Federal prosecutors say they've never seen a stronger case. The Mackenzies' own records have implicated 32 corrupt officials across 3 territories. Judge Carlton's already confessed to everything, hoping for leniency." Grace nodded, his movements precise as he prepared the day's second batch of sourdough. "Justice, like a proper starter culture, spreads naturally once the conditions are right," he observed. The Mackenzies spent 13 years building their empire on corruption. Now, that same meticulous record-keeping will ensure its complete dismantling. Sarah Cooper arrived with the morning's edition of the territorial newspaper. The Mackenzie case dominated the front page, with detailed accounts of the corruption they had uncovered. More significantly, the paper reported on the systematic reforms being implemented across the territory, using Millbrook Valley's transformation as a model for other communities. "Robert would have been proud," she said quietly, watching Grace work. "Not just of bringing down the Mackenzies, but of how you did it. Building evidence, establishing proper procedures, ensuring lasting change." Her fingers traced her husband's name in the article, listed among the victims whose deaths would finally see justice. "A good baker," Grace replied, his ghost-pale eyes softening slightly, "understands that his work affects the entire community. Bread nourishes the body, but justice nourishes the soul. Both require proper preparation and attention to detail." He carefully scored the top of a loaf, creating the pattern that had become his signature. Robert understood that. He knew that standing against corruption meant more than just fighting. It meant building something better. Chief Marshal Hawkins arrived as the morning crowd began filtering into the bakery. Citizens who had once hurried past with downcast eyes now moved with newfound confidence, greeting each other warmly as they collected their daily bread. The marshal observed this transformation with satisfaction. "The territorial governor wants to present you with a commendation," he informed Grace. "Your methods in bringing down the Mackenzies are being studied as a model for dealing with organized corruption throughout the West." Grace continued his work, measuring ingredients with practiced precision. "The commendation belongs to Millbrook Valley," he responded. "A single baker can produce only so many loaves. But teach a community to value justice, to stand together against corruption, and you create something that sustains itself." Colonel Winchester appeared in the doorway, his uniform immaculate despite the dusty street outside. "The military tribunal is particularly interested in your documentation of the Chancellorsville massacre," he reported. "Your evidence will finally bring closure to hundreds of families who never knew the full truth about their loved ones' deaths." The colonel placed a weathered photograph on the counter, the same image of the McKinnon brothers in their Confederate uniforms that James had kept hidden for 13 years. "They'll face military justice for their wartime crimes after the territorial courts finish with them. Your patience in building this case ensured they'll answer for everything." Grace studied the photograph briefly before returning to his work. 13 years ago I made 2 promises," he said quietly. "One to the men who died at Chancellorsville, that their killers would face justice. The other to myself, that justice would be served properly, not just through violence, but through the law itself." Old Tom Wilson entered the bakery, accompanying his daughter Martha, who had recovered fully from her ordeal during the final confrontation. "The town council has voted unanimously," he announced. "The old Mackenzie mansion will be converted into a courthouse and municipal offices. Sarah Cooper's been appointed as the new property registrar to oversee the return of stolen lands." Grace allowed himself a small smile as he slid another batch of rolls into the oven. "Appropriate," he noted. "A symbol of corruption transformed into an instrument of justice, like converting stale bread into bread pudding. Nothing wasted, everything repurposed for the good of the community." The morning proceeded with its new routine as federal agents continued their work. Citizens reclaimed their dignity, and the smell of fresh-baked bread mingled with the sound of hammers and saws rebuilding the town. Grace moved through it all with his characteristic precision, each loaf perfectly baked, each pastry expertly crafted, his deadly skills now fully dedicated to nourishing rather than ending life. "Will you stay?" Sarah Cooper asked. voicing the question many had wondered. The bakery's rebuilt, the Mackenzies are finished, justice is being served. Surely that completes your mission here. Grace carefully removed a perfect loaf from the oven before responding. A proper sourdough starter, he observed, needs regular attention to maintain its strength. The same is true of justice. Millbrook Valley has found its courage, but maintaining it, helping it grow stronger, that's a different kind of mission. He began preparing ingredients for the next batch. Besides, someone needs to keep baking the bread. 1 year after the fall of the Mackenzie brothers, Millbrook Valley had undergone a transformation as complete as any of Thomas Grace's perfectly baked loaves. The spring morning air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread and new-sawn lumber as citizens went about their business in a town that had become a model of frontier justice and good governance. The former Mackenzie mansion, now the territorial courthouse, stood as a symbol of transformation. Its elaborate gates, once designed to intimidate, had been replaced with welcoming iron work crafted by the town's blacksmith. Where armed guards had once patrolled, citizens now came freely to conduct legitimate business and seek proper justice. Grace stood in his bakery doorway, ghost-pale eyes surveying the changes his patience had wrought. Sarah Cooper approached, carrying the latest newspaper from the territorial capital. The headline announced the final verdict in the military tribunal. All 3 Mackenzie brothers had been found guilty of wartime treason. The sentences would be carried out within the month. "The last piece of justice," Sarah remarked, handing him the paper. "Though your bread has already done more to heal this town than any number of verdicts." Indeed, Grace's bakery had become more than just a business. It served as a gathering place where citizens could speak freely, where the smell of fresh bread reminded everyone that life continued to improve. Marshal Harper, now permanently assigned to Millbrook Valley at the territory's request, entered the bakery with news from his latest patrol. 2 more towns have adopted our governance model, he reported, accepting his usual morning role. The territorial governors using Millbrook Valley as an example of how to rebuild communities affected by systemic corruption. Grace nodded, his movements precise as he prepared the day's specialty loaves. A good recipe, properly shared, benefits everyone, he observed. The same is true of justice. The Mackenzies didn't just control this town. They created a template for corruption that spread across the territory. Now, we're providing a template for reformation. The changes were evident everywhere. The mining claims, once controlled through intimidation and fraud, now operated under clear regulations enforced by an elected board. The Merchant Association, led by Sarah Cooper, had established fair practices that encouraged new businesses. Even the saloons, once centers of vice and violence, now operated under licenses that required them to maintain order. Old Tom Wilson arrived with his daughter Martha, who had recently been appointed the town's school teacher. "Full enrollment this term," she reported proudly. "Families that fled during the Mackenzies' reign are returning. They've heard about the changes here." She placed a fresh bouquet on the baker's counter, a weekly tradition that had started after Grace had saved her life during the final confrontation. Dr. Morrison entered next, bringing news from his latest circuit of outlying ranches. "Health's improving everywhere," he noted. "Amazing what happens when people aren't living in constant fear. Even the mining accidents have decreased since the safety regulations were implemented." Grace listened to these reports as he worked, his hands shaping dough with the same precision that had once made him the Union Army's deadliest sharpshooter. Each loaf received the same careful attention he had once given to tracking the Mackenzies, each pastry crafted with the patience that had allowed justice to rise properly. The afternoon brought a visit from Chief Marshal Hawkins, conducting his monthly inspection of the territory's model town. "The governor's office has processed the last of the Mackenzies' seized assets," he announced. Every stolen property has been returned, every victim compensated. The records you helped us uncover made it possible to trace everything. Grace continued his work as the marshal spoke. Justice, like bread, requires proper distribution, he observed. It's not enough to create it. It has to reach everyone who needs it. His ghost-pale eyes surveyed the street outside, where new construction continued to reshape the town. The Mackenzies spent 13 years building an empire of fear. We've spent 1 year showing how quickly hope can grow when properly nurtured. As evening approached, the town council convened in their new chambers, once the Mackenzies' gaming room. Sarah Cooper presented the quarterly financial reports showing legitimate prosperity, replacing ill-gotten gains. The mining operations, now run fairly, produced more wealth than they had under corrupt management. Merchants reported increasing trade as Millbrook Valley's reputation for honest dealing spread. A year ago, Sarah concluded her report, we were a town living in fear, controlled by memories of violence and corruption. Today, we're showing the entire territory what justice looks like when it's allowed to work properly. She glanced at Grace, who had supplied bread for the meeting. All because one baker decided that proper justice, like proper bread, was worth waiting for. Grace's response was characteristic of the man who had transformed their town. Bread nourishes the body, he said quietly, but justice nourishes the soul. Both require patience, precision, and faith that doing things properly yields the best results. He began gathering his things to return to his bakery. The Mackenzies tried to build an empire on fear. We've built something stronger on justice. Like a proper sourdough starter, it will keep growing as long as we tend it properly. The autumn morning brought a crisp chill to Millbrook Valley as Thomas Grace prepared his ovens for the day's baking. The early light revealed a town, transformed not just by new buildings and prospering businesses, but by the confident bearing of its citizens. The sound of the morning stage arriving carried none of the tension it once had when it might have brought another of the Mackenzies' enforcers. Marshal Harper entered the bakery, bringing news from the territorial capital. "It's done," he announced quietly. The Mackenzie brothers faced the firing squad at dawn. Their last request was for clemency, but given the evidence you helped uncover, there was never any real chance of that. Grace continued his methodical preparation of the day's first batch of bread, his movements as precise as they had been when he used to clean his rifle. "Justice, like baking, requires completion," he observed. "Leave something half done, and the results are never satisfactory." Sarah Cooper arrived soon after, carrying telegrams from other towns seeking guidance on implementing Millbrook Valley's governance model. "The territorial governor wants to establish a permanent commission," she reported. "They're using our recovery as a template for fighting corruption throughout the West." Beam, the baker's ghost-pale eyes, surveyed his domain as he worked, noting how the morning sun caught the new glass in his windows that no longer needed to be positioned for defensive firing angles. "Proper procedures once established tend to spread naturally," he noted. "Like a healthy sourdough starter, good governance just needs the right conditions to thrive." Colonel Winchester made an unexpected appearance, his military bearing somewhat softened by the peaceful surroundings. "The families of the Chancellorsville victims send their thanks," he informed Grace. "With the McKinnon brothers' true identities confirmed and justice served, many can finally find closure after 13 years. Grace nodded, scoring the top of a loaf with the same precision he had once used to line up impossible shots. "Closure, like a properly baked loaf, requires patience," he responded. The Mackenzies thought time would bury their crimes. Instead, it allowed justice to rise properly. As the morning progressed, Millbrook Valley's citizens went about their business with a sense of purpose that had been absent under the Mackenzies' reign. The mining office, now run by a board of elected officials, processed claims fairly. The Merchants' Association, led by Sarah Cooper, enforced regulations that ensured honest competition. Even the saloons operated under rules that promoted order rather than chaos. Old Tom Wilson arrived with news from the latest town council meeting. "We're expanding the school," he announced proudly. "Martha's got more students than ever, now that families know their children can learn in safety." He paused, watching Grace work. Hard to believe that a year ago we were all living in fear of the Mackenzies' daily collections. Grace's response carried his characteristic measured tone. "Fear rises quickly but falls easily," he observed, checking the temperature of his ovens. "Justice, properly prepared, provides a more lasting foundation. Like a well-maintained starter culture, it keeps producing results long after the initial work is done." The afternoon brought Chief Marshal Hawkins, making his final official visit before retirement. "You've done more than bring down 3 criminals," he told Grace. "You've shown the entire territory that corruption can be fought systematically, that justice requires more than just gunsmoke and vengeance." Grace continued his work as the marshal spoke, each movement precise and purposeful. "The Mackenzies' greatest mistake," he noted, "was thinking that fear could build something lasting. Fear, like poorly made bread, might seem impressive at first, but ultimately fails to nourish." As evening approached, the citizens of Millbrook Valley gathered for a celebration marking the official completion of the town's restoration. The former Mackenzie mansion, now the territorial courthouse, hosted the event in its newly renovated chambers. Grace supplied the bread, each loaf as perfect as the justice he had helped deliver. Sarah Cooper, addressing the gathered crowd, spoke of transformation. "A year ago, a baker came to our town," she began. "We thought he was just another traveler, perhaps another victim for the Mackenzies to terrorize. Instead, he showed us that justice, like the bread he bakes, requires patience, precision, and unwavering dedication to doing things properly." Grace listened from his customary place near the back of the room, his ghost-pale eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. The town had changed, not just in its physical appearance but in its very nature. The fear that had once permeated every interaction had been replaced by a confidence born of properly administered justice. "You know what the most important ingredient in bread making is?" he asked Marshal Harper as the celebration continued. "It's not the flour or the water or even the yeast. It's faith. Faith that if you follow the proper procedures, if you give it the time it needs, the results will justify the effort." The marshal nodded, understanding. "The same could be said of justice," he observed. "You spent 13 years preparing for this, making sure every detail was perfect." Grace's slight smile carried the satisfaction of a master craftsman appreciating work well done. "Some things," he replied, "are worth the wait." 5 years after the fall of the Mackenzie brothers, Thomas Grace stood in his expanded bakery, watching the sunrise paint Millbrook Valley in shades of gold. The town had grown beyond recognition, its prosperity built on the foundation of justice he had helped establish. The morning air carried not just the scent of fresh bread, but the sounds of a thriving community that had become a model for the entire territory. Chief Justice Rebecca Martinez of the Territorial Supreme Court, visiting for the dedication of the new Judicial Training Center, entered the bakery, seeking both breakfast and wisdom. "Your methods have transformed law enforcement throughout the West," she told Grace as he served her a perfectly baked croissant. "Every major case now follows what we've come to call the Millbrook Protocol: systematic evidence gathering, proper documentation, and patience in building comprehensive cases." Grace continued his work, his ghost-pale eyes still carrying the same precise focus that had once made him the Union Army's deadliest marksman. "Justice, like proper baking, is ultimately about process," he observed, measuring ingredients with characteristic precision. The Mackenzies' fall wasn't just about ending their reign, it was about showing how corruption can be systematically dismantled. Sarah Cooper, now the Territorial Commissioner for Property Rights, arrived with the latest statistics. Under the new systems established in Millbrook Valley, corruption cases were being successfully prosecuted at 5 times the previous rate. More importantly, prevention programs had reduced the formation of criminal enterprises across the territory. "The ripples keep spreading," she noted, watching Grace work. "Every town that adopts our methods shows the same pattern: initial resistance from entrenched interests, followed by systematic transformation. Just like you always said, justice, properly prepared, rises naturally." The morning brought a steady stream of visitors, merchants starting their day, miners heading to their legitimately registered claims, and citizens conducting honest business in a town that had become synonymous with proper governance. Each person who entered the bakery found not just perfectly crafted bread, but a living reminder of how patience and precision could transform a community. Marshal Harper, his hair now grey but his dedication unchanged, brought news from the latest Territorial Law Enforcement Conference. "They're teaching your methods at the new Marshal Training Academy," he informed Grace. "Not just the tactical aspects, but the underlying philosophy, how systematic justice, properly applied, prevents the need for violence." Grace nodded as he scored another loaf with expert precision. "The Mackenzies built their empire on fear," he observed. "Fear works quickly but crumbles easily. What we built here, based on proper procedures and justice, continues to strengthen over time. Like a well-maintained sourdough starter, it becomes more robust with each passing year." As noon approached, a special ceremony gathered the townspeople in front of the former Mackenzie mansion. The building, which had once symbolized corruption and fear, now housed not just the territorial court, but also a center for training law enforcement officers in systematic justice. The dedication plaque bore a simple inscription: "Justice, like bread, nourishes when properly prepared." Grace attended the ceremony in his customary quiet way, standing at the back of the crowd in his flour-dusted apron. The territorial governor, speaking to the assembled citizens, acknowledged the transformation that had begun in this small town. "The Mackenzie brothers thought they were building an empire," the governor noted. "Instead, they unknowingly created the conditions for a revolution in justice, guided by a baker who understood that proper procedures yield lasting results." As evening settled over Millbrook Valley, Grace returned to his bakery to prepare the next day's starter. The tools of his former life, the precise rifle, the deadly pistols, remained carefully maintained but rarely used. His hands, once known for dealing death at impossible distances, now created sustenance for a community built on proper justice. "You've never regretted staying?" Sarah Cooper asked him as she stopped by for her evening bread. "After the Mackenzies were gone, after justice was served, you could have moved on." The question carried the weight of 5 years of transformation, of watching a simple bakery become the heart of a revolution in justice. Grace's response carried the same measured precision that had made him legendary in 2 very different fields. "A proper starter culture," he explained, "needs consistent attention to maintain its strength. The same is true of justice. What we built here isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about nurturing something that sustains entire communities." The next morning, as always, Thomas Grace arrived before dawn to begin his baking. His ghost-pale eyes, which had once struck fear into Confederate forces and corrupt officials alike, now surveyed the peaceful town with quiet satisfaction. The Mackenzie brothers were 5 years dead, their empire of fear transformed into a foundation for systematic justice. But the real victory wasn't in their defeat. It was in the thriving community that had risen in place of their corruption. Like the perfect loaves he created each day, justice in Millbrook Valley had been cultivated with patience, precision, and unwavering dedication to proper procedure. And like his famous sourdough starter, it would continue nourishing future generations, a lasting testament to the baker who understood that the best recipes, whether for bread or justice, required time to develop properly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.